Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has sharply criticized the United States, accusing Washington of breaking promises and acting in bad faith following the seizure of a tanker carrying Russian crew members. Speaking publicly, Lavrov demanded the immediate and unconditional release of the detained Russian sailors, warning that the incident represents yet another serious blow to already strained relations between Moscow and Washington. Lavrov's remarks came amid growing diplomatic tension after US authorities intercepted and seized a tanker in international waters, detaining crew members that included Russian nationals. According to Moscow, the seizure was carried out unlawfully and was followed by assurance from Washington that the Russian crew would be released promptly. Lavrov said those assurances were made at a high diplomatic level but have not been honored, prompting what he described as deep disappointment and anger on the Russian side. The Russian foreign minister accused the United States of undermining trust by failing to follow through on its commitments. He said such behavior damages not only bilateral relations, but also the broader system of international dialogue and diplomacy. Lavrov emphasized that promises made during diplomatic engagements must be respected, warning that repeated failures to do so erode confidence and make constructive engagement increasingly difficult. At the center of the dispute is the tanker seized by US authorities, which Washington claims was involved in sanctions evasion. US officials have argued that the vessel was part of a network used to transport oil in violation of American sanctions policies. Moscow has rejected these claims, insisting that the tanker was operating legally and that the seizure amounted to an abuse of power carried out beyond US jurisdiction. Russian officials argue that the interception took place in international waters, where freedom of navigation is protected under international maritime law. They contend that no country has the right to board or seize a foreign-flagged vessel in such waters without clear legal authorization, such as a United Nations mandate or the consent of the flag state. According to Moscow, none of those conditions were met in this case. Lavrov placed particular emphasis on the fate of the Russian crew members, describing their continued detention as unacceptable. He stressed that the sailors were civilians carrying out their professional duties and should not be treated as criminals or bargaining chips in geopolitical disputes. Moscow has demanded guarantees regarding their safety, humane treatment, and swift return home. The Russian foreign minister said that initial contacts with US representatives created the expectation that the issue would be resolved quickly. He claimed Washington indicated that a decision had already been made to release the crew, but days later no concrete steps had been taken. Lavrov described this gap between words and actions as evidence of broken promises, and warned that such conduct would not be forgotten. From Washington's perspective, the seizure is part of a broader effort to enforce sanctions and curb what it describes as illicit oil trade linked to sanctioned states. US officials have maintained that sanctions enforcement is a matter of national security and international responsibility, and that vessels and crews involved in sanction-busting activities may face legal consequences. The United States has not publicly committed to releasing the detained Russian sailors, suggesting instead that legal procedures must be followed. This divergence in positions highlights a fundamental clash between the two countries over the scope and legitimacy of unilateral sanctions enforcement. While the United States views its actions as lawful and necessary, Russia sees them as extraterritorial overreach that violates international law and threatens the stability of global maritime commerce. The incident has also attracted attention beyond Washington and Moscow, with legal experts and international observers expressing concern about its implications for maritime governance. The principle of freedom of navigation is a cornerstone of global trade, and actions perceived as arbitrary or politically motivated could set precedents that worry shipping nations and commercial operators alike. For Russia, the seizure touches on broader concerns about the treatment of its citizens abroad. The Kremlin has repeatedly stated that protecting Russian nationals is a priority, and cases involving detention or arrest often become high-profile diplomatic issues. Lavrov's strong language reflects not only anger over this specific case, but also frustration with what Moscow sees as a pattern of hostile behaviour by the United States. The dispute unfolds against the backdrop of already tense US-Russia relations, marked by disagreements over security, sanctions, military deployments, and global influence. In recent years, diplomatic channels between the two countries have narrowed, and incidents involving detained citizens or assets have frequently escalated into wider confrontations. Energy politics add another layer of complexity to the situation. Oil and gas exports remain central to Russia's economy, and enforcement actions targeting tankers have the potential to disrupt markets and shipping routes. Moscow views such actions as part of a broader strategy to pressure Russia economically, while Washington frames them as legitimate efforts to uphold international norms and punish violations. Domestically, Lavrov's stance also serves a political purpose. By publicly condemning the United States and demanding the release of Russian sailors, the Russian government reinforces its narrative of standing firm against Western pressure and defending national interests. This messaging resonates with domestic audiences and aligns with broader themes of sovereignty and resistance to external interference. For the United States, the incident underscores its determination to maintain a tough line on sanctions enforcement. US officials argue that backing down could weaken the credibility of sanctions regimes and embolden actors seeking to bypass restrictions. At the same time, prolonged detention of foreign crew members risks further diplomatic fallout and criticism from allies and neutral states alike. As the standoff continues, diplomatic engagement remains uncertain. Russia has made clear that it expects concrete action rather than further explanations, while the United States appears unwilling to reverse course quickly. Observers note that such disputes often become protracted, with resolution depending on behind-the-scenes negotiations rather than public statements. Whether the tanker crew will be released in the near term remains unclear. What is evident, however, is that the incident has deepened mistrust between Moscow and Washington and added another point of friction to an already complex relationship. Lavrov's accusation of breaking promises is likely to echo in future diplomatic exchanges, shaping how Russia approaches negotiations with the United States. In the broader context, the episode highlights the fragile state of international cooperation at a time of heightened geopolitical rivalry. As major powers increasingly resort to unilateral measures, disputes over legality, sovereignty and enforcement are becoming more common. The fate of the Russian tanker crew has thus become more than a consular issue. It is a symbol of the challenges facing diplomacy, international law and global stability in an era of deepening division.